please give us your name and your date of birth?
Okay, my name is Rhoda Makoff, and I was born September 4th, 1937. When I was very little, we lived in Altadena, where we had a typical California bungalow that my parents bought for $3,000. And every weekend, we would go to the beach. Of course, this was in the late 30s, early 40s. The boardwalk in Venice and Ocean Park in particular, whatever that iteration of it was just beach going. And the minute you got from Pasadena to the beach by the Pasadena Freeway, which was the first freeway in Los Angeles and was opened in 1937, the first thing we could smell was a mixture of orange blossoms and salt water.
So what was Venice like in those days at the beginning when you were coming? What do you remember your impressions of Venice?
You know, as a 3, 4, 5, 6-year-old child, not much except from photos. And I saw that my dad was what would now be considered a gigantic surfboard. So I can only assume that these huge surfboards were in use in Venice, and there was Curry's ice cream. And we brought ham sandwiches and egg sandwiches and an umbrella and sat at the beach, including my grandmother. Let's jump now to the early 50s. We had moved from Altadena to Pasadena to Beverly Hills, and I went to Beverly Hills High School. Okay. And about the early 50s, my grandparents, my father's parents in Chicago, decided to move to California. My father had a brother and sister, but my grandfather had a heart attack, and they thought it would be much easier living in California. So they moved to the Jewish community in Venice. I mean, at that time, a really nice apartment in Beverly Hills probably was $300 or $400 a month. They moved to a 2-family house on Dudley Court, which is still there, but when I go back to look, I'm expecting it to disappear soon. But my guess is it didn't cost more than $15, $20 a month.
Wow. So you were starting to come to Venice regularly at that time as a teenager?
To visit them,
right.
And they had 2 synagogues.
On the beachfront?
On the beachfront. And I can remember when I would visit on the weekends, lots of old Jewish people. If you looked at pictures from the East Coast and the boardwalks, it looked exactly the same. A lot of old people, probably my age, sitting on the boardwalk. My grandparents, I guess like most Jewish communities, since they were a couple, my grandmother would take in boarders, mainly single men who needed food, and they would share their meals with people in the community. And my grandmother belonged to one of the synagogues, and my grandfather belonged to the other synagogue.
They belonged to different synagogues?
Yes, I asked her, at that time, I think she was about 75 and he was probably about 80, and I asked her why they didn't go to the same synagogue, and she told me that his synagogue was where the old people went.
So it didn't have to do with like reform or conservative or that, it was that she
Right. I think they were all conservative
right.
or Orthodox. I don't think there was a reformed temple down there. Now,
do you
one
remember
of
the names of the temples?
No, but I know that one of them is now John Jurdy's architecture firm.
Okay, where it was.
Where it was. And the other one, I don't know if it's still there, but I think they held services in the what is now called the community center. They lived on Dudley Court. And the interesting thing about the Cadillac Hotel is at the end of Dudley Court. And across from it is always something. And as we progressed into the 60s, that something became, I believe, Venice West, or a comparable poetry reading coffee house, because that was the time that there were coffee houses all along Sunset Boulevard. And at that period, these beatniks appeared in Venice. So mixed in with the old Jewish people were these bearded young men and these young women in black stockings. And one day I went to visit my grandmother, and we usually walked from the house and took a walk on the boardwalk. And there on the beach would be all these beatniks. And my grandmother looked at me very quizzically, and she always spoke to me in Yiddish. She never spoke to me in English. And she said, "Don't these people work?" So that was the hippie beatnik era in Venice.
And what did you know about the poets or the beatniks as a teenager, as a young adult at that time?
I was going to a lot of coffee houses on Sunset Strip and loved the whole scene. I was really a beatnik wannabe at that time. But later on, I read a book on Venice West, on all the poetry there, and I didn't really appreciate the fact that that was what was going on there till later. We belonged to the Sand and Sea Club, which is where Jews, blacks, and entertainers could go to the beach. All the other clubs were restricted.
And where was that in Santa Monica?
It's where the Annenberg Beach House is, and where Marion Davies' house was. And when we were in high school, the house was still there, and we had full run of it for parties and things like that. So that was the beach for us. But on holidays like Passover, it was very funny because everybody's grandparents seemed to live in Venice, and you'd look in the alley and there were all these very classy cars, which you would never see in Venice because everybody's relatives were visiting their parents and grandparents for Passover.
So what was your perspective on the difference between when you would come to Venice, the Venice beach scene versus those other beach scenes, Santa Monica and other places? What was your feelings and thought about that?
It was cuter. It was more rustic, and the people were more interesting, and it was just a fun thing. And later on, when I was dating my husband and then subsequently married him in the mid to late 50s, we would come down and go to a service on a Friday night or something, and all the old Jewish people. My husband was a medical student, and he would have his blood pressure cuff, and the joke was that he could come down and take blood pressures every Saturday or Sunday and make a lot more money than he was as a medical student. But they loved when we went into the synagogue that there were these young kids in the synagogue because everybody was old. I think there was a real community sense. The women had things they did, and the men, of course, were praying all the time. And at a point, after we had gone back east to do some training, my grandfather passed away, and my grandmother's sister moved in with her on Dudley. So they stayed probably in Venice till the early 70s. And then once my grandmother's sister passed away, my grandmother was doing poorly, and my aunt moved her back to Chicago to be in a home there. Nobody can get a view of a whole place in a very short time. I think my husband and I decided that you had to live someplace at least 2 weeks to even get the flavor of it, and probably closer to 3 or 4 months. You felt that Venice was a very unique place that encompassed all sorts of people and all sorts of views. It just expanded what I felt about Venice in the first place. It was just a really interesting, very mixed community in every respect you could imagine.